Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into a pivotal time based on the sources you sent us, the 2024 U.S. election and, well, the first 100 days of the second Trump administration.
Yeah, it's quite a lot to unpack.
We've got election analyses, looking at results, campaign strategies, what voters were thinking, plus reports on those early policy moves, and, of course, Elon Musk's rather large role in all of it.
Right.
So the mission here is to try and cut through all that complexity for you, give you a clear sense of the election dynamics, those rapid policy shifts, and the immediate ripple effects, both here and globally.
Exactly. Trying to pull out the key insights.
Yeah.
So maybe we should start with the election itself, the outcome.
Sounds good. What did the numbers show?
Well, the sources point to a pretty clear electoral college win for Donald Trump. It was 312 electoral votes to 226 for Kamala Harris.
Okay.
But what's really notable, maybe hinting at a bigger shift, is the popular vote. Trump actually got a plurality there, 49.8% to Harris's 48.3%.
Wow. So the first Republican popular vote win since, what, 2004?
That's the one. It's significant. Winning both, it suggests maybe a wider mandate than his first win.
Right. Not just squeaking by in the electoral college. How did he pull it off statewise?
He managed to flip 6 key states that Biden had won back in 2020. We're talking Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin.
That's quite a mix. Rust Belt, Sun Belt?
Exactly. That diversity suggests it wasn't just regional issues, right? There were probably national factors really driving things across the board.
And historically, this win was pretty unusual too, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. First president since Grover Cleveland, way back in 1892, to win a second term non-consecutively.
That's incredible.
And he's the first Republican ever to do that. Plus, the first president to win after facing 2 impeachments. Quite a few historical footnotes there.
Definitely. And what about the actual electoral college process this time? Any drama like in 2016?
No, actually. The sources say it was pretty uneventful. No faithless electors popping up.
Hmm. So maybe more party unity behind him this time compared to 2016?
That could be one interpretation, yeah. Seems like the party structure was more solidly aligned.
Okay, so Trump wins. Let's get into the how. What were the competing campaign strategies? Trump versus Harris.
Right. So Trump's strategy, based on the materials, was heavily focused on firing up his base, energizing those core supporters.
Less focus on traditional GOTV, maybe.
Seems like it. A lot of that was apparently outsourced. The core message was still very much America first, hitting hard on economic revival, border security, that kind of thing.
And negative ads.
Oh, yeah. Significant negative advertising, especially targeting Harris on cultural issues like transgender rights. That seemed aimed at specific voter groups.
Interesting.
And his abortion stance was, well, a bit modulated maybe, framed it as a state issue, said he'd veto a national ban.
And did that approach work? Who did it connect with?
It seems to have resonated. The sources show gains with working-class voters continuing, but also, importantly, significant gains with Black and Hispanic men, and young men too.
Okay, so that's Trump's approach. What about Harris? Big shift for her campaign after Biden stepped aside.
Huge adjustment, yeah. Her strategy then pivoted to mobilizing the Democratic base. Reproductive rights became really central.
The thinking being that overturning Roe would be a massive motivator.
Exactly. That was the bet. Plus, focus on climate change, healthcare. The messaging was about unity, fresh leadership, contrasting her with what they called Trump's regressive policies.
And they put resources into that.
Oh, yeah. Heavy investment in traditional advertising, the ground game, all that.
Yeah.
Very much aligned with the Biden administration's priorities before the change.
But it sounds like maybe those traditional methods didn't hit the mark this time.
The sources suggest Trump's higher tempo, especially with rallies in those key battleground states, gave him a visibility edge.
Right.
Both campaigns had to adapt, obviously, with Biden's withdrawal, the assassination attempt on Trump. Big events. But Trump's overall message just seemed to connect more in that polarized environment.
Especially with the economy and immigration being such big concerns for voters.
Precisely. Harris's focus on specific policies in the traditional playbook, it just didn't seem to generate the kind of turnout they were counting on.
So we had the strategies. Let's talk platforms. What were the core differences in what each party was actually offering, the vision?
Big differences. The Republican platform, very much Trump-influenced, that Make America Great Again theme. Economically, it was about fighting inflation, energy dominance, meaning more fossil fuels, extending those 2017 tax cuts, aiming for a 15% corporate tax rate.
Harris too, right?
Big time. Tariffs, boosting manufacturing, immigration was another huge one, seal the border, mass deportations, aiming to end birthright citizenship, more wall funding, using the military at the border, ideological screening for immigrants,
Okay, and social issues.
abortion back to the states.
Yeah.
But they also voiced support for birth control and IVF, ending what they called gender insanity, keeping men out of women's sports, pushing parental rights, patriotic education, cutting funding for things like CRT and gender ideology in schools, defending the Second Amendment, religious freedom,
In foreign policy.
peace through strength, America first, modernizing the military, pushing allies to spend more on defense, strong support for Israel, skepticism about more Ukraine aid, countering China,
Got it. And governance.
ending the weaponization of government agencies, election security measures, and importantly, promising to protect Social Security and Medicare.
Okay, that's a clear picture for the Republicans. How did the Democratic platform stack up against that?
Well, the Democrats, building on Biden-Harris priorities, focused on the economy differently. Tax cuts for working and middle-class folks, paid for by taxing the wealthy and corporations more. Investments in infrastructure, clean energy, small businesses, raising the minimum wage, strengthening unions, tackling corporate greed.
And their approach to immigration.
Comprehensive reform. Border security through tech and personnel, not just a wall. A pathway to citizenship for the undocumented, expanding legal channels. Very different.
Social issues for Democrats.
Codifying Roe v. Wade into law was huge. Protecting contraception, IVF, repealing the Hyde Amendment, passing the Equality Act for LGBTQ+ rights, focusing on racial equity, criminal justice reform, expanding voting rights, gun safety measures, investing in public education, universal pre-K, tackling student loan debt.
Foreign policy under the Democrats.
Strengthening alliances was key. Supporting Ukraine against Russia, managing competition with China, but maybe less confrontationally, supporting Israel, but also a two-state solution, preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons, restoring U.S. leadership on climate change.
Right, big contrast there. And governance.
Also protecting Social Security and Medicare, lowering drug costs through negotiation, investing in mental health, protecting kids online, combating the opioid crisis, supporting veterans.
Yeah, laying them out side by side really highlights just how fundamentally different those visions for the country were.
Absolutely. And connecting that back to the voters. The sources show this widespread dissatisfaction, a lot of economic anxiety leading up to the election.
People feeling worse off.
Yeah, a Gallup poll showed over half felt financially worse off. Economic confidence was low. There was this real sense that people wanted major changes.
What issues were really driving that feeling? What mattered most to voters?
The economy, definitely number one for many. Inflation, cost of living, you heard it everywhere. Immigration was also a huge and rapidly growing concern.
And for Democrats specifically.
For them, the health of democracy itself and abortion rights were really high priorities. Beyond that, you had healthcare, crime, national security, the Supreme Court, all significant factors.
What about issues like climate change or transgender rights? Where did they fit?
Important to some segments, for sure, but the data suggests they ranked lower as overall priorities for the electorate compared to those economic and border concerns.
So kitchen table issues, direction of the country, and how did people see the candidates on these key issues? Who did they trust more?
Generally speaking, Trump was seen as stronger on handling the economy, inflation, and immigration.
Okay.
Heirs tended to get better marks on climate change, abortion rights, and healthcare.
And those perceptions must have really played into people's final decisions, right? Especially with the economy and immigration being so prominent.
Almost certainly, especially for those undecided or swing voters.
What about younger voters? What were their main concerns?
The picture painted by the sources is one of general pessimism among young Americans, facing economic hardship, low trust in institutions. Financial security was reportedly their top priority, and there were even some rumblings within the Democratic base, concerns about what some saw as excessive political correctness or whether the party truly reflected their values.
Okay, so we've got the results, the campaigns, the platforms, the voter mood. Let's try and pull it all together. What were the key factors that really explained Trump's win and Harris's loss?
It looks like a combination of things. Trump really built on those gains he'd made with the working class. And the inroads with Latino and African-American men were significant, plus doing better with young men.
Right.
His campaign seemed to rely a lot on that personal connection he has with supporters for mobilization. The negative ads on cultural issues seemed effective. That slightly moderated abortion stance might have helped too.
And he tapped into that dissatisfaction we talked about.
Absolutely. Capitalizing on the economic anxiety, the immigration concerns, and just being out there more. The higher tempo of campaign events probably didn't hurt.
So what went wrong for Harris? What were her biggest challenges?
Well, she started with the baggage of low approval ratings tied to the previous administration, especially on the economy and immigration.
And Biden leaving the race late didn't help?
Probably not.
Yeah.
It arguably made it harder for her to carve out her own distinct identity. And that big bet on reproductive rights driving turnout, it seems it didn't mobilize voters quite as much as they had hoped. She also seemed to underperform with male voters generally, and some sources mention difficulty establishing a really clear profile, maybe perceived reluctance to engage fully with the media.
And the Democratic coalition itself was maybe fraying a bit.
The signs pointed that way, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially among working-class voters and minority men moving away. Plus, just that strong anti-incumbent mood driven by economic pessimism worked against her.
It really does sound like evidence of a potential political realignment underway. Those working class and minority male shifts towards the GOP, driven by economy and immigration.
It's definitely a major storyline emerging from the analysis, yeah. Now, we can't really talk about a modern election without getting into the rhetoric, the polarization, the disinformation. How did that play out in 2024?
Yeah, the atmosphere felt incredibly charged, didn't it? The sources definitely describe intense polarization, these widening gaps, very tribal politics. Real policy debate often got lost in the noise.
And Trump's rhetoric specifically, often described as extreme, sometimes with authoritarian language, using simple, emotional, often attack-based stories, and frequently using falsehoods.
Like what?
Things like the immigration invasion narrative, blaming Democrats entirely for the economy, hitting hard on cultural grievances around gender, CRT, lots of hyperbole, even questioning Harris's racial identity at times.
How did Harris push back against that?
Her campaign tried to frame Trump as divisive, fear-mongering, regressive. They pushed themes of unity, progress, freedom, inclusion, pointing to his record, arguing he was a threat to democracy.
And the ever-present issue of disinformation.
Huge factor. It spread like wildfire on social media, especially X. Amplified by influencers, sometimes the candidates themselves, just fabricated stories, misleading claims about candidates, about issues.
Eroding trust even further.
Exactly, eroding trust in traditional media.
Yeah.
And the ease of creating fake videos, fake audio now is just adds another dangerous layer. X, under Musk, was specifically mentioned as amplifying pro-Trump narratives.
What's driving all this polarization? It feels relentless.
It's complex, right? Multiple drivers. Real policy differences, for sure. But also our campaign finance system, gerrymandering, party primaries pushing candidates to the extremes, psychological stuff like in-group bias, demonizing the other side.
Economic stress plays a role.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Economic stress, cultural anxieties, demographic shifts.
Yeah.
And then the media environment, partisan news outlets, social media algorithms, feeding us what we already believe.
Yeah.
It all just escalates the, what they call effective polarization, the actual dislike and distrust between partisans.
Okay, so election's over. Trump wins. Then we hit the first 100 days of Trump 2.0, and the sources describe just this whirlwind of policy changes.
Whirlwind is a good word for it. A really rapid, sweeping series of changes, mostly done through executive orders, executive actions.
And a lot of it seemed to align with Project 2025, that conservative plan.
Very strong alignment, yes. That blueprint seemed to be a major influence.
What were the main areas they hit right away?
Immigration and border security were huge priorities from day one. Trade and tariffs saw dramatic action. Energy and environmental policy shifted sharply.
And that new department, DOGE.
Right, the Department of Government Efficiency, led by Elon Musk. That was a big move aimed at restructuring government, cutting spending, plus significant action on social issues, education, DEI, LGBTQ plus rights.
It sounds like a strategy to implement a specific agenda very, very quickly, often going around Congress.
Precisely. Relying heavily on executive power meant speed, but it also immediately triggered a ton of legal challenges, questioning whether they could actually do all these things.
Let's dive into some specifics. Immigration seemed like ground zero. What happened there?
It was intense. They declared a national emergency at the border, called it an invasion, deployed the military, shifted funds for the wall, essentially shut down asylum processing at the border.
Shut it down. How?
Discontinued the CBP-1 app used for scheduling appointments. Reports said border apprehensions dropped like 95% almost overnight because the legal pathway was effectively closed.
Wow. And inside the country?
Interior enforcement ramped up massively, expanded expedited removal nationwide. ICE officers reportedly got quotas. They rescinded policies that limited enforcement in sensitive locations like schools or hospitals, expanded programs like 287G that deputized local police for immigration enforcement, threatened sanctuary cities.
What about refugees or other humanitarian paths?
Severely restricted.
Hmm.
Suspended refugee admissions entirely for a period, tried to terminate programs like parole for Central American minors, tried revoking temporary protected status for some nationalities.
Even legal immigration was targeted.
Yeah, attempts were made to end birthright citizenship, though that faced immediate court challenges. Stricter extreme vetting, talk of new travel bans, some student visas were revoked, though that was later reversed, and EO making English the official language. Various measures seemingly designed to encourage self-deportation.
Like what?
Increased data sharing between agencies like CBP and the IRS. Talk of revoking Social Security numbers, imposing daily fines for overstaying visas, expanding detention capacity.
And using obscure laws.
Yes. They invoked the Alien Enemies Act, an old law from 1798 to try and deport certain non-citizens, which ended up at the Supreme Court. Reports of firing immigration judges, pressuring others to dismiss asylum claims faster.
So the overall strategy was just deterrence and restriction across the board.
Seems like it. Heightened enforcement everywhere, shutting down pathways, using harsh rhetoric like invasion, leveraging obscure legal tools. Creating a climate of fear was likely part of the goal.
Okay, that's a huge shift on immigration. What about the economy and those tariffs you mentioned?
Another area of dramatic action. Declared a national emergency on the trade deficit, using IEEPA as justification. Slapped a minimum 10% tariff on almost all imports.
10% minimum.
On everything, pretty much. Then announced higher reciprocal tariffs 11% to 50% on countries with the biggest trade deficits with the U.S., though most of those got paused after talks, except for China.
What happened with China?
Tariffs there went way up, reportedly reaching 145% on some goods. Steel and aluminum tariffs went up globally to 25%, with new rules about domestic production. A 25% auto tariff was introduced, though later eased a bit for cars assembled here, even with foreign parts.
Any other trade actions?
Yeah, they ended that de minimis rule for cheap packages coming from China, launched Section 232 investigations into critical minerals, copper, timber, suggesting more tariffs could come. Even considered tariffs on pharmaceuticals.
What was the economic fallout from all this?
Immediate market volatility. Stocks dropped, bond yields rose, business and consumer confidence plummeted, recession fears spiked.
Forecasts.
Generally negative. Major banks predicted hits to global growth, downgrades to U.S. GDP. Increased inflation was a big concern, maybe core inflation hitting 3–4%. The argument was any revenue from tariffs would be wiped out by the broader economic damage.
So the goal was leverage and protectionism, despite the risks.
That seems to be the read, yes. Use tariffs aggressively to force negotiations and protect domestic industries, even knowing it could cause significant economic pain and uncertainty.
And we saw major shifts in healthcare and environmental policy, too.
We did. On healthcare, steps were taken to roll back parts of the ACA, patient protections, funding for signing people up. EOs came out pushing for more price transparency. Another EO, ending taxpayers' subsidization of open borders, looked like a move towards stricter public charge rules for immigrants.
Any changes to Medicare, Medicaid?
Reports of attempts to freeze some federal grants. Some Medicare innovation models were eliminated, though one called TEAM survived. An EO aiming to lower drug costs, possibly through negotiation. Stricter enforcement of the Hyde Amendment banning federal abortion funding, and actions targeting gender-affirming care.
How so?
Orders restricting access and federal funding, especially focused on care for minors, using terms like chemical and surgical mutilation.
Okay, and environment, energy. A complete reversal.
Pretty much. Clear priority on boosting fossil fuels. Declared a national energy emergency. Launched an Unleash American Energy initiative, more oil, gas, coal drilling and mining, faster permits, rolling back support for renewables.
Pulled out of the Paris Agreement again?
Immediately. And halted all climate finance payments to the UN. Paused approvals for wind projects, which some states challenged. Resumed oil leasing in ANWR. Expanded offshore drilling. Targeted environmental review rules under NEPA. Got rid of the social cost of carbon calculation.
Even small regulations.
Yeah, rescinded rules on things like showerhead water flow. Terminated grants and research for clean energy. Reports started coming out pretty quickly about job losses in the clean energy sector, stalled investments.
Wow, just a fundamental change in direction. Then you have social issues, education, LGBTQ plus stuff, DEI. What happened there?
Day one, an EO came out basically ending all federal DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion programs, grants, contracts, stripped DEI language from government websites.
And on gender and LGBTQ plus issues.
Another major EO defining sex as strictly binary and unchangeable. That impacted federal documents, prisons, military service. rolled back previous protections based on sexual orientation and gender identity, reinstated the ban on transgender people serving in the military,
More specific actions.
EOs banning taxpayer funds for what they called sex change surgeries, restricting gender-affirming care for youth, tried to ban trans women and girls from sports by threatening school funding, targeted LGBTQ+ health equity programs and research,
What about education?
an EO directing the closure of the Department of Education itself with staff cuts, promoted school choice, parental rights bills, push for patriotic civics education, cut funding tied to CRT or gender ideology in schools,
Higher education, too.
targeted accreditation, wanted to remove DEI requirements, prioritize intellectual diversity, increase transparency rules for foreign funding of universities, some initiatives to support HBCUs, but focused on private partnerships, state matching funds, and changes to school discipline policies, emphasizing common sense over disparate impact analysis.
And amidst all this completely new entity, DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, with Elon Musk involved. That's wild.
It really was unconventional. EO 14158 set it up, co-led by Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. The mandate was huge. Cut waste, fraud, abuse, shrink the federal workforce and spending, improve efficiency, bring in tech, especially AI.
Run government like a startup.
That was the language used, yeah. They set up a temporary task force within the U.S. Digital Service to help, expiring in mid-2026.
What did DOGE actually do?
Agency spending reviews, terminated or renegotiated contracts, grants, hiring freezes, buyouts, layoffs, big numbers. Estimates were like 300, 400,000 federal job cuts planned for 2025, restricted travel, government credit cards, reviewed federal property.
And the data access part sounds controversial.
Hugely controversial. Got extensive access to data from Treasury, CFPB, HHS, Social Security, VA, education. Reportedly even edit access in some cases. Major privacy and security alarms went off.
Using AI for what?
Reports said analyzing data for waste fraud, but also surveilling employee communications for dissent, or DEI talk, potentially helping immigration enforcement, working with Palantir, also advising DOJ on fraud cases.
Did it work? Did it save money?
That's where it gets really murky. Critics said the cost-saving targets like $1–2 trillion were totally unrealistic. They maybe found $160 billion, but even the accuracy of that was questioned. Plus, the cost of the workforce reductions themselves was estimated at $135 billion.
And the controversies kept coming?
Oh, yeah. Lawsuits over the data access, violating the Privacy Act, condemnation of the AI employees' surveillance, concerns about disrupting vital government services. Musk himself reportedly stepped back a bit after the initial blitz.
So a radical experiment with questionable results and major ethical flags.
That sums it up pretty well. Applying tech logic to government, but facing massive legal, ethical, and practical hurdles.
And throughout this, the influence of Project 2025 seems to hover over everything.
It really does. That Heritage Foundation blueprint. While the campaign officially kept its distance, the sources suggest the transition team heavily used its resources, its personnel. The overlap between early policies and Project 2025 recommendations is just undeniable.
In what areas particularly?
Government restructuring, like going after the Department of Education, social and cultural policy, ending DEI, the LGBTQ+ actions like defining sex as binary, the trans military ban, targeting gender-affirming care funding, changing Title IXs, immigration, the aggressive enforcement, mass deportations, restricting pathways, energy and environment prioritizing fossil fuels, deregulation, pulling out of climate deals, and just the overall approach, assertive executive power, that unitary executive theory.
So even if not followed page by page, it was a key playbook.
Absolutely. It clearly served as a roadmap for rapidly rolling out a very conservative agenda using executive power.
How did all this land domestically? What were the reactions?
Industries felt it differently. Tariffs were disruptive for anyone relying on imports, auto, electronics, retail, travel, delivery services, food and beverage, anyone using lots of steel or aluminum.
Winners.
Domestic steel and aluminum producers, maybe textiles, some farmers. Domestic oil and gas saw potential upsides. But overall, increased costs, supply chain chaos, uncertainty, less investment in hiring seemed to be the dominant theme from tariffs.
And other policies.
Clean energy definitely hit setbacks, job losses, stalled projects, healthcare providers faced uncertainty, defense industry priorities shifted, tech felt the heat from DOGE and data issues, universities dealt with accreditation changes.
And the pushback. Legal challenges.
A massive wave of lawsuits, challenging the immigration EO's birthright citizenship, Alien Enemies Act use, parole programs, sensitive locations policy, challenging the DEI termination, the targeting of law firms, helping immigrants, the grant freezes, environmental rollbacks, agency restructuring, you name it.
Did the courts step in?
Yes. Federal courts issued temporary blocks, injunctions against some key things, like the birthright citizenship move, some funding freezes, the targeting of law firms. The legal system became a major battleground.
What about Congress and the states?
The Republican Congress was mostly supportive, or at least quiet. One exception was using the Congressional Review Act to try and block an EPA methane rule. Democrats were strongly opposed, constantly linking actions back to Project 2025, introducing bills that had little chance of passing.
States pushed back more.
Democratic states, yes. Attorneys general sued the federal government over things like wind energy pause, funding freezes. Some blue states tried to keep pushing their own climate goals, though the administration asserted federal power over state climate and ESG efforts. Immigration was another big potential federal-state fight brewing, and the FEMA shift pushed more disaster responsibility onto states.
So aggressive executive action met resistance, mainly in the courts, while Congress was somewhat sidelined.
That seems to be the pattern in those early months. Executive dominance, with legal battles as the primary check.
Okay, let's pivot to Elon Musk specifically. His role seems unprecedented for a private citizen.
He really does, both in the election and then inside the administration.
Yeah.
During the election, he became this massive estimates of $291 million, mostly to Trump and Republicans,
Through his channels.
mostly super PACs. America PAC got the lion's share, $239 million. RBG PAC got over $20 million that funded some controversial ads. Senate Leadership Fund got $10 million, a big shift from his past, more bipartisan giving. America PAC funded GOTV, some weird sweepstakes thing too,
And he used X?
massively to boost Trump, attack Harris, push MAGA themes. Critics pointed to a lot of misleading content, doctored videos, conspiracy theories spreading on the platform under his free speech absolutism banner. He hosted Trump on X Spaces, floated that government efficiency commission idea publicly.
Seen as appealing to certain voters?
Yeah, some analysis suggests that he was like an ideal avatar for those younger male voters leaning Trump, bringing that tech disruptor energy. So it was this combo, huge money through unconventional passives, plus control of a major platform. Analysts see it as really pivotal to Trump's win.
Financial power and narrative power. And then he gets this DOGE co-lead role.
Right, which we covered.
Co-leading with Ramaswamy, repurposing USDS, broad mandate, the startup government idea.
The actions, spending reviews, contract terminations, hiring freezes, layoffs, data access.
Exactly. Extensive data access, Treasury, CFPB, HHS, SSA, VA, education. Edit access in some cases, using AI for analysis, employee surveillance, identifying DEI, potentially aiding immigration enforcement with Palantir, input on military spending, air traffic control.
And the controversies we discussed. Unrealistic goals, question savings, huge privacy legal concerns over data access, the AI surveillance backlash, workforce disruption costs.
All of it, leading to lawsuits, condemnation, and Musk reportedly reducing his direct involvement over time. A radical experiment, questionable achievements, major red flags legally and ethically.
What seems to be driving Musk here? What's his motivation, his strategy, and what's the impact?
Publicly, he talks about fighting waste and fraud. He's clearly opposed to the Democrats' direction, voices concerns about wokeism, declining birth rates. And this desire to apply business efficiency to government seems genuine in a way.
His strategy seems multi-pronged.
Definitely. Leverage wealth for donations, leverage X to shape narratives, attack opponents, mobilize supporters bypassing traditional media, build a close alliance with Trump money and platform support in exchange for influence, like the DOGE role. He's also shown support for far-right movements internationally.
And the societal impact.
Amplifying polarization and disinformation via X is a big one. His rhetoric, his actions, some argue, normalize attacks on democratic norms. DOGE policies cause real harm, job losses, service disruptions, fear in federal and immigrant communities. The data practices raise massive surveillance state concerns. Protests against his companies have happened. It looks like a mix of ideology, maybe business interests, deregulation helps his companies, and pure personal influence.
It really throws the whole issue of billionaire influence into sharp relief, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Musk is a case study. That level of spending, $277 million plus, just shows the power of super PACs drowning out grassroots voices.
And the donor-to-advisor pipeline.
Yeah, blurring the lines between private wealth and government power. Huge conflict of interest risks. Risk of state capture, essentially.
Owning the platform is another layer.
Massive narrative control. Bypassing media gatekeepers. Risk of suppressing views he doesn't like.
Accountability is tricky, too.
Exactly. Advisors, or these quasi-government roles, don't have the same oversight as elected officials or civil servants. And research shows the wealthy often have very different policy priorities than average people. So who is government serving?
when billionaires have this much sway.
Are there ways to counter this?
People are trying things like state-level campaign finance reform. But Musk's example really highlights the challenge to equal representation and accountability when you have that level of concentrated wealth and power.
Okay, let's shift to the global view. How did the world react to Trump winning again and these rapid policy changes?
A real mixed bag. Enthusiasm from leaders like Netanyahu in Israel, Orban in Hungary, predictable maybe?
Hopeful reactions from others?
Yeah, Zelensky in Ukraine, Putin in Russia, Taiwan, even the Taliban offered congrats, but often tied to specific hopes or outcomes they wanted to see.
What about traditional allies? Europe.
More pragmatic, cautious congratulations. UK, France, NATO leadership, the EU, Italy, Turkey. They stressed the relationship, but hinted at concerns. NATO funding, Ukraine aid, tariffs were definitely on their minds. Macron explicitly called for a more sovereign Europe, less reliant on the U.S.
Skepticism from neighbors.
Canada worried about trade. Mexico feared tariffs. Colombia concerned about border policy, climate change. Residents in Gaza reportedly didn't expect much change for them.
What about rivals or adversaries?
Iran and Hamas kind of dismissed it, but Iranian markets got nervous. Civil society groups, human rights, democracy orgs were very worried. Feared U.S. disengagement, more support for autocrats, funding cuts.
So uncertainty was the main theme.
Pretty much. It showed global uncertainty. Nationalist leaders felt aligned. Democratic allies felt apprehensive. Potential for shifting alliances. Rivals like China probably saw opportunities in perceived U.S. inconsistency.
And the economic impact globally from those tariffs must have been huge.
Immediate and significant. That aggressive policy, 10% minimum, higher reciprocal tariffs, the huge China tariffs, 25% on steel, aluminum, and the auto tariffs, justified under IEPA Section 232, it just rocked global markets.
Volatility.
Big time. Stocks down, bond yields up, confidence plummeted globally. Major economists projected hits to global growth. JPM saw maybe a 1% cut. U.S. GDP forecasts were downgraded. Inflation forecasts went up. U.S. core maybe 3–4%.
Supply chains got messed up again.
Accelerated that fragmentation,
Yeah.
Companies scrambling to diversify, reshore maybe. But it's costly, slow, less efficient.
Yeah.
And the policy unpredictability itself discouraged investment.
Regional impacts.
Canada's auto sector worried. Mexico and Canada expected GDP hits. Asian manufacturers faced disruption. China faced challenges, but maybe saw chances if U.S. leadership weakened. The whole strategy, while aimed at protectionism and leverage, created massive uncertainty, threatened growth, fueled inflation, and forced costly supply chain changes.
What about international security alliances like NATO, relationships in Asia?
For NATO, Trump's return instantly brought back his skepticism, undermined faith in the U.S. commitment to collective defense, renewed pressure on allies to spend more, questioned Article 5 guarantees,
How did Europe react?
accelerated their push for strategic autonomy, boosting their own defense. Huge alarm over the idea Trump might cut a deal with Russia over Ukraine, bypassing them.
And Asia Pacific.
Still a focus on countering China. Likely support for the Quad continued. But Trump's transactional style cast doubt on commitments to Japan, South Korea. Pressure likely increased for them to pay more for U.S. troops, maybe a more assertive Taiwan stance, which carries escalation risks.
So allies started hedging.
Yeah, increasing their own defense spending, diversifying security partnerships, hedging against U.S. unpredictability.
Broader geopolitical shifts.
Eroded trust in the U.S. as a reliable partner. Created potential vacuums for rivals like China to fill. America First resonated with some populists globally, but weakened traditional alliances. Concerns about nuclear proliferation maybe rose. Trump's rhetoric sometimes questioned sovereignty norms. A shift away from multilateralism toward bilateral deals just increased global instability concerns.
So America First potentially weakens America's global standing by weakening its alliances.
That's the paradox, yes.
Mm.
Fostered uncertainty among allies, pushed them to look elsewhere, created openings for competitors.
How did this affect global governance? International institutions like the UN?
The intent seemed clear. Disengage and reshape. Withdrew from Paris, signaled withdrawal from WHO. Started reviews of UN bodies like the Human Rights Council, UNESCO. Cut funding to UNRWA for Palestinian refugees. Just general skepticism of multilateralism, preference for unilateral or bilateral action.
Financial commitments cut too.
Yes, halted climate finance, froze or reviewed USAID foreign aid, shifted aid priorities towards U.S. strategy, migration control, ideological alignment, economic returns for the U.S.
Undermining international norms.
Widely perceived that way on trade, human rights, refugees, environment. Weakened the ability to tackle global problems collectively, created that vacuum for China, Russia, emboldened anti-democratic leaders.
So a weakening of the whole system.
Potentially, yeah. Accelerating a shift to a more fragmented, multipolar, maybe dysfunctional world order.
Yeah.
U.S. retreat reduced its own influence within the institutions it helped build, though it also spurred other actors to try and sustain cooperation without the U.S.
And the impact specifically on climate change efforts, that must have been damaging.
A huge setback. EO 42150 pulled the U.S. from Paris, and the UNFCCC immediately stopped climate finance like Green Climate Fund payment.
Combined with domestic policy.
Right. Boosting fossil fuels, rolling back regulations, pausing renewables, killing the social cost of carbon calculation. It all sent a terrible signal.
Global implications.
Jeopardized the 1.5 degrees C warming limit. Gutted funding for vulnerable countries needing help. Weakened leverage to push other big emitters like China. Emboldened fossil fuel interests globally. Potentially hurt progress at COP29 and beyond. Created uncertainty for green investments, ESG. U.S. emissions likely projected to rise again.
Any counterweights?
Some. Other big countries stuck to their goals. U.S. states, cities, businesses, activists kept pushing. Renewables kept getting cheaper. Climate lawsuits continued. But overall, a major blow to global climate cooperation.
Finally, how did the world react to the harsh U.S. immigration policies and the human rights concerns they raised?
Strong condemnation from human rights groups globally. Closing asylum, suspending refugees, trying to end birthright citizenship using the Alien Enemies Act, widely seen as violating international law, like the Refugee Convention, Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
And the invasion rhetoric.
Criticized as dangerous, dehumanizing. Groups like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, Physicians for Human Rights called it cruel, harmful to vulnerable people, part of an anti-rights agenda.
Broader concerns.
That U.S. actions undermine multilateralism, embolden authoritarians to do similar things. Tangible impacts, too, disruption to U.S. aid programs globally, health, food, refugees, human rights. Fear in U.S. immigrant communities, making them avoid services. Targeting foreign student activists raised alarms.
So a very negative reaction from global civil society.
Overwhelmingly negative, yes. The administration's approach was seen as an assault on basic human rights principles and international cooperation.
Okay, looking ahead now, what's the likely policy path for the U.S. in the near term, say the next year or two?
Expect continued pursuit of that core agenda. Assertive executive power, likely continued volatility. Economically, more deregulation. A push to extend the Trump tax cuts, but that'll be a fight in Congress. Tariffs remain central, unpredictable. China tensions likely stay high. Continued push for fossil fuels. DOGE cuts to spending and workforce likely continue. Effectiveness still debated.
Economic outlook.
Forecast generally shows slower growth, maybe 1–2%. Inflation sticking around, maybe 2.8–3.0%.
Immigration.
Hardline stance continues. Ongoing border security focus, enforcement, deportations, legal battles over key policies will go on. Net immigration likely lower.
Social issues.
Continued DEI rollbacks, enforcing binary sex definition. Potential federal moves on abortion funding, medication access. More pressure on education curricula, parental rights.
Foreign policy.
America first, transactional. Focus on China competition, demanding more from NATO allies, reassessing alliances, trying to cut deals in Ukraine, Middle East terms uncertain, maybe more disengagement from international bodies.
Governance.
Assertive executive power continues, likely friction with courts. Big legislative fights looming, spending, debt ceiling, tax cuts could test GOP unity. Overall, expect a disruptive environment, focus on immigration, trade, deregulation, cultural issues via executive action, ongoing legal fights, economic uncertainty, and strained international ties.
What about the mood of the country now, say mid-2025, according to these sources?
Still, deeply polarized. Significant dissatisfaction overall. Presidential approval low, maybe low 40s, disapproval over 50%, plurality giving the first 100 days an F. Even some slight erosion among Republicans.
That pessimism continues.
Yeah, most feeling the country's on the wrong track under Trump's policies. Majorities disapproving of the tariffs think they hurt the economy, and the agency cuts think they worsen government costs more long-term. Feeling the administration rush changes.
Any consensus points?
Strong bipartisan agreement on obeying court rulings. High concern about a potential constitutional crisis. Approval underwater on economy, foreign policy, immigration.
How's the opposition looking?
Democrats struggling too. Low favorability in some polls. GOP slightly better viewed, but it feels like broad public frustration, not love for either side.
Views on the economy.
Mixed on the current state, but mostly negative outlook. Increased recession worries. Cost of living still a huge issue. Overall, polarization, Low confidence in the president and his policies, persistent pessimism about the country and economy, independents leaning negative, lack of enthusiasm for Democrats suggest it's deeper than just anti-Trump sentiment.
And looking way down the road, 2028, Trump's ineligible. What might that election look like?
Open seat, so
Yep.
likely very competitive primaries on both sides. Battlegrounds probably similar, Rust Belt, Sun Belt.
What shapes that race?
Performance of the Trump admin between now and then. The economy, obviously. Demographics keep shifting. Polarization levels. And the 2026 midterms will be a big signal.
Who might run on the Republican side?
Could be wide open. Names floated include Vance, DeSantis, Cruz, Rubio, maybe Haley again, Ramaswamy, even Tulsi Gabbard, perhaps. The challenge is navigating Trumpism, appeal to the base, but seem electable.
And Democrats?
Also likely crowded. Harris, Newsom, Shapiro, Whitmer, Pritzker, Bashir, Healy, Booker, Klobuchar, Ossoff, Buttigieg, maybe AOC, Ro Khanna. Big debates likely on economics, immigration, how progressive to be, how to win back working-class moderates, maybe even a fight over the primary calendar again.
Key issues for 2028.
Probably familiar themes: economy, immigration, healthcare, Social Security, Medicare, climate, abortion, foreign policy, and the health of democracy itself will likely still be a big one. It really depends on how the next few years unfold under this administration, the economy, and the strategic choices both parties make.
This has been, wow, an incredibly thorough look at a really dense and impactful period. It's clear the 2024 election, those first 100 days, they've really set a new course.
Absolutely. The election itself was this major comeback, fueled by those economic and immigration anxieties. And then the administration hit the ground running with these rapid, often controversial policies, largely through executive power, heavily influenced by conservative plans like Project 2025, and with unprecedented players like Musk involved.
Triggering huge reactions at home and abroad.
Yeah.
Exactly. Highlighting just how divided the country is and really reshaping America's place in the world.
So a final thought for you, our listener. Given everything we've just discussed, this trend of assertive executive power, the influence of non-traditional figures like billionaires in governing, what does the future of American governance even look like? And maybe more importantly, what role can public opinion realistically play in steering that ship beyond just the next election? This deep dive offers a snapshot, a really detailed one, but the long-term consequences, they're still playing out, and they really demand your continued attention and critical thinking. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.